January 20th, 1953, Washington, D.C. The morning arrived cold and bitter. The kind of cold that seeps through wool overcoats and settles into bone. Along Pennsylvania Avenue, crowds gathered in thick clusters, their breath rising in pale clouds against the winter sky. Flags snapped in the wind. Vendors hawked commemorative programs. Camera shutters clicked like the ticking of 1,000 pocket watches. The air carried the metallic scent of snow that hadn't yet fallen, mingled with the exhaust of idling motorcars and the faint smell of roasted chestnuts from corner stands. This was Inauguration Day, the peaceful transfer of power that had become America's sacred ritual. And yet, beneath the pageantry, beneath the careful choreography of democracy in motion, something had fractured. At precisely 10 o'clock in the morning, a black limousine bearing the seal of the president-elect pulled up to the north portico of the White House. Inside sat Dwight David Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe during the greatest war the world had ever known, liberator of continents, architect of victory. He was now to become the 34th President of the United States. Protocol demanded that he enter the White House, share coffee with the outgoing president, exchange pleasantries, and ride together to the Capitol for the swearing-in ceremony. It was tradition, it was civility, it was the way things had always been done. But Eisenhower did not leave the car. He sat in the back seat, jaw set, blue eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the limestone facade of the executive mansion. His military bearing remained impeccable, shoulders square, hands folded in his lap, but those who knew him recognized the subtle tension in his posture, the deliberate stillness of a man exercising iron control. Minutes passed. Secret Service agents shifted uncomfortably. Aides exchanged worried glances. Inside the White House, Harry S. Truman waited, the small-town haberdasher from Missouri, who had never wanted to be president, but had inherited the job when Franklin Roosevelt's heart finally gave out in Warm Springs, Georgia. Truman stood in the Blue Room, checking his watch, his own expression hardening with each passing moment. Finally, an aide was dispatched. There would be no coffee, no handshake in the privacy of the White House, no moment of reconciliation between the outgoing and incoming commanders. When Truman emerged from the building, walking down the steps alone, the two men greeted each other with the barest minimum of civility. They entered the limousine together for the ride to the Capitol, but they did not speak. They did not look at each other. The silence between them was as thick and impenetrable as armor plate. This was not supposed to happen, not in America, not between two men who had both devoted their lives to serving their country, who had both stood at the highest levels of power during the most consequential decade in human history. But it did happen, and the reasons why reached deep into the nature of loyalty, pride, and the terrible weight of decisions, made in wartime, decisions that echo long after the last gun falls silent. To understand the frozen silence in that limousine, you must first understand what had come before. You must travel backward through the years to a time when these two men were not equals, when one held absolute authority and the other served at his pleasure, when the relationship between them seemed unshakable. The year was 1942, and the world was burning. Dwight Eisenhower, then a brigadier general with little combat experience, had spent most of his military career behind a desk. He was brilliant at logistics, at planning, at the intricate chess game of moving men and material across vast distances. But he had never commanded troops in battle. He had never heard the sound of artillery tearing the earth apart or smelled the copper-sweet scent of blood on a battlefield. He was 51 years old, and military protocol suggested his career was approaching its end, not its beginning. Then everything changed when America entered the war after Pearl Harbor. Chief of Staff George Marshall recognized something in Eisenhower that others had missed: a capacity for grand strategic thinking, an ability to navigate the treacherous politics of coalition warfare, and perhaps most importantly, a talent for getting strong-willed men to work together toward a common goal. Marshall brought Eisenhower to Washington, placed him in the War Plans Division, and within months had appointed him to command American forces in the European theater. It was a meteoric rise that left more senior officers stunned and resentful. And who was the man in the White House then? The man who would ultimately approve Eisenhower's appointment as Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe. Not Harry Truman, but Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the patrician from Hyde Park, who had remade American government and was now remaking the world order. But Roosevelt was already dying, his health failing in ways carefully hidden from the American public. Beneath him, waiting in the wings, was his vice president, a man Roosevelt barely knew, had barely consulted, had chosen primarily to balance the ticket in the 1944 election, Harry Truman. When Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945, Truman inherited not just the presidency, but the final stages of a global war. He inherited the Manhattan Project, the secret development of atomic weapons. He inherited the complex negotiations with Stalin and Churchill. He inherited the planned invasion of Japan, projected to cost 1 million American casualties. And he inherited responsibility for the men in uniform, including one particular general, whose star had risen higher and brighter than any other dot in the spring and summer of 1945. As Allied forces closed in on Berlin from west and east, as concentration camps were liberated and the full horror of Nazi genocide was revealed, Eisenhower stood at the pinnacle of his achievement. He was not just a general, he was a symbol, the embodiment of American military might and democratic values. His photograph appeared on the cover of every major magazine. His name was spoken with reverence. He had done what many thought impossible, held together a fractious alliance of British, American, French, and Soviet commanders, coordinated the largest amphibious invasion in history at Normandy, and driven straight into the heart of Hitler's Reich. Truman, the new president, recognized Eisenhower's value immediately. He needed the general, needed his prestige, his competence, his ability to command respect both at home and abroad. In November 1945, Truman appointed Eisenhower as Chief of Staff of the Army, replacing George Marshall. It was one of the most powerful positions in the American military. The two men were not friends, not intimates, but they worked together with professional courtesy. They respected each other's roles. They understood the chain of command, but buried in that relationship, invisible at first, were the seeds of what would eventually grow into bitter enmity. They were seeds planted in soil, made rich by ego, ambition, and the complicated legacy of war. They would not sprout for years, but when they did, they would strangle whatever goodwill had existed between the two men. The first crack appeared in 1948, though at the time it seemed insignificant, a mere ripple across the surface of their relationship. That year, Truman faced what many considered an impossible re-election campaign. His approval ratings had plummeted. The Democratic Party was fracturing. Southern Democrats had bolted to form the states' rights Democratic Party in protest of Truman's civil rights initiatives, while progressive Democrats had rallied behind Henry Wallace's third-party bid. The Republicans, confident of victory, nominated Thomas Dewey, the polished governor of New York. Political analysts across the country predicted Truman's defeat. The Chicago Tribune famously printed newspapers with the headline, "Dewey defeats Truman," hours before the final results came in. In this moment of political desperation, Truman did something remarkable and revealing. He approached Eisenhower, who had by then retired from active military service to become president of Columbia University, and offered him the Democratic nomination for president, not vice president. President. Truman would step aside, relinquish his own claim to the office. If Eisenhower would agree to run as a Democrat, it was an extraordinary gesture, one that revealed both Truman's political pragmatism and his genuine admiration for Eisenhower. But it also revealed something else, a fundamental misunderstanding of the general's character and ambitions. Eisenhower declined. He had already publicly stated that professional military officers should not seek political office while on active duty or shortly after retirement. He believed in civilian control of the military. He believed that generals who became politicians undermined the very democratic principles they had fought to defend. But Truman's offer planted an idea, or perhaps merely confirmed one that had already taken root. Eisenhower was the most popular man in America. Polls showed that he could win the presidency as either a Democrat or a Republican. Both parties wanted him, and slowly, gradually, Eisenhower began to reconsider his stance. Not because he craved power, those who knew him best insisted he genuinely didn't, but because he believed the country was drifting in the wrong direction. He believed Truman's policies, particularly in foreign affairs and economic management, were flawed. He believed he could do better. In 1952, Eisenhower announced he would seek the Republican nomination for president. The news sent shockwaves through the political establishment, but nowhere did it land harder than in the White House. Truman felt betrayed. He had offered Eisenhower the presidency on a platter, had been willing to subordinate his own ambitions to what he perceived as the greater good, and Eisenhower had declined. Now the general was running anyway, but as a Republican, the party of Truman's opposition, the party that had spent 6 years attacking everything Truman had tried to accomplish. Truman's resentment might have remained manageable, might have been contained within the bounds of political rivalry, except for what happened next. During the 1952 campaign, Eisenhower did something that Truman considered unforgivable. He failed to defend George Marshall. George Catlett Marshall was perhaps the most respected figure in American public life in the years following World War II. As Chief of Staff during the war, he had orchestrated the mobilization and deployment of American military might across 2 oceans. After the war, as Truman's Secretary of State, he had crafted the European Recovery Program, the Marshall Plan, which helped rebuild Western Europe and contained Soviet expansion. He had then served as Secretary of Defense. During the early stages of the Korean War, Marshall was a soldier-statesman of the highest order, a man whose integrity and competence were questioned by almost no one. Almost no one. Senator Joseph McCarthy, the demagogue from Wisconsin who had built his political career on anti-communist hysteria, had decided that Marshall was part of a conspiracy so immense and an infamy so black as to dwarf any previous venture in the history of man. McCarthy's charges were absurd. He suggested that Marshall had deliberately allowed China to fall to communism, that he had sabotaged American interests to serve Soviet goals, that he was either a dupe or a traitor. The attacks were baseless, paranoid, and vicious. They were also politically potent in the fevered atmosphere of the early Cold War. Eisenhower owed everything to Marshall. Marshall had plucked him from obscurity, had given him command, had defended him against critics, had made his career possible. The 2 men were not close friends. Marshall maintained a certain formal distance from all subordinates, but Eisenhower understood the depth of his debt. During the 1952 campaign, Eisenhower initially planned to defend Marshall publicly during a campaign stop in Wisconsin, McCarthy's home state. He drafted remarks praising Marshall and rebutting McCarthy's slanders. Then, under pressure from Republican Party leaders who feared alienating McCarthy's supporters, Eisenhower removed those remarks from his speech. He stood on the same platform as McCarthy, smiled for photographs, and said nothing in Marshall's defense. He chose political expediency over personal loyalty. He chose the presidency over honor. For Truman, this was the ultimate betrayal. Marshall was his friend, his most trusted advisor, the man he had relied upon during the most difficult decisions of his presidency. To see Eisenhower remain silent while McCarthy destroyed Marshall's reputation, Eisenhower, whom Marshall had made, was unbearable. Truman's language became vitriolic. In private, he called Eisenhower a coward. In public, he was only slightly more restrained, suggesting that Eisenhower lacked the moral courage necessary for presidential leadership. But there was more to Truman's anger than just the Marshall incident. There was Korea, that grinding, bloody, frustrating war that had begun in June 1950, when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. Truman had immediately committed American forces to defend South Korea under the banner of the United Nations. It was the first hot war of the Cold War, and it quickly became a political disaster for Truman's administration. The war went badly at first, then brilliantly after General Douglas MacArthur's audacious landing at Inch, then catastrophically when Chinese forces intervened after MacArthur pushed north toward the Chinese border, when MacArthur publicly challenged Truman's authority and advocated for expanding the war into China. Truman fired him, a decision that was constitutionally correct but politically devastating. The war then settled into a bloody stalemate along the 38th parallel, with thousands of Americans dying in battles over hills and ridges that were won, lost, and won again without any clear strategic purpose. By 1952, Korea had become Truman's albatross. During the campaign, Eisenhower promised he would go to Korea if elected, implying that his military expertise could somehow break the deadlock and end the war. It was a masterful political stroke, vague enough to avoid specific commitments, but powerful enough to capture the imagination of a war-weary public. Truman saw it as a cynical exploitation of military credentials, a suggestion that Truman himself had mismanaged the war through incompetence rather than confronting the genuine strategic complexities involved. But perhaps the deepest wound, the one that cut closest to Truman's sense of himself, involved allegations about Truman's administration being soft on communism and riddled with corruption. During the campaign, Eisenhower's supporters attacked the Truman administration relentlessly, dredging up every scandal, every hint of impropriety, every example of Soviet espionage that had occurred during Truman's watch. The charges of corruption were largely overblown. Truman himself was scrupulously honest, though some of his associates were not. But the suggestions that Truman had been weak on communism, that he had somehow allowed Soviet agents to infiltrate the government, struck Truman as grotesque distortions of his record. Truman had, after all, implemented the Truman Doctrine, committing America to contain communist expansion worldwide. He had authorized the Berlin airlift when Stalin blockaded the city. He had established NATO. He had committed American forces to Korea, rather than allowing communist aggression to go unchallenged. He had instituted loyalty programs within the federal government, however flawed they proved to be. And yet Eisenhower's campaign painted Truman as negligent, as insufficiently vigilant, as a man who had presided over American decline. For Truman, a man who prided himself on his toughness, his decisiveness, his willingness to make hard choices without flinching, these attacks were personal. They struck at his core identity, and they were being made, or at least tolerated, by a man Truman had elevated, a man whose political viability depended entirely on military accomplishments. That Truman, as president, had authorized and supported. The election results on November 4, 1952, surprised no one. Eisenhower won in a landslide, carrying 39 states and capturing 442 electoral votes to Adlai Stevenson's 80. The American people, exhausted by Korea, anxious about communism, and ready for change after 20 years of democratic control of the White House, had chosen the general. They had chosen competence over ideology, military glory over political experience. They had chosen Eisenhower. In the weeks between the election and inauguration, there should have been a transition period of cooperation and mutual respect. Previous outgoing presidents had welcomed their successors, shared information, offered advice. The transfer of power in a democracy requires a certain amount of graciousness from the loser, an acknowledgement that the people have spoken and must be obeyed. But Truman could not bring himself to play that role. The final explosion came in December 1952, during what should have been a routine transition meeting. The issue was Korea, and specifically, whether Eisenhower planned to fulfill his campaign promise to visit the war zone before taking office. Eisenhower did indeed plan to go, and he informed Truman of his intention. The meeting, by all accounts, was tense and awkward. Each man sat stiffly, words carefully chosen, the air between them crystallizing with unspoken resentment. At some point during this meeting, accounts vary on the exact sequence. Truman made a comment about Eisenhower's son, John Eisenhower, who was serving as an army officer in Korea. The exact wording is disputed, lost to the imperfect memories of those present, but the substance is clear. Truman suggested that if John Eisenhower were to accompany his father on the Korea visit, it might be seen as the son receiving special treatment, being pulled from danger for a publicity stunt. He implied that it would be inappropriate, that it would undermine morale, that it would appear as though Eisenhower was using his position to protect his own son, while other fathers' sons remained in harm's way. Eisenhower's face went rigid, his jaw clenched. The military composure that had served him so well in 1,000 difficult situations nearly cracked. Whatever restraint had existed between the two men evaporated in that moment. To attack a man's son, to suggest that a father's natural concern for his child's safety was a character flaw, to weaponize family in a political dispute. This crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Eisenhower's defenders would later argue that Truman's comment was unfair and cruel, a low blow from a bitter man lashing out in defeat. Truman's defenders would counter that he was merely raising a legitimate concern about appearances, that in the hothouse atmosphere of the transition, every action by the president-elect would be scrutinized, and that Eisenhower was being oversensitive. But the truth of who was right and who was wrong mattered less than the effect. The relationship, already badly damaged, was now completely destroyed. After that meeting, Eisenhower and Truman did not speak except when absolutely necessary. The normal transition activities became stilted, formal affairs conducted through intermediaries. Eisenhower stopped attending meetings at the White House. Information was exchanged through staff members. The two men existed in separate spheres, circling each other like binary stars whose mutual gravity prevents collision but whose distance ensures they will never touch. And so we return to January 20, 1953, to that cold morning in Washington. to Eisenhower sitting in the limousine, refusing to enter the White House, to Truman emerging alone, to two men riding together in silence to the Capitol, where one would take the oath of office that the other was relinquishing. The crowds that lined Pennsylvania Avenue saw two men in an open car, waving dutifully, performing the ritual of democratic transition. They did not see the chasm between them. They did not understand that what they were witnessing was not a peaceful transfer of power but a frozen war, a cold peace between men who would never forgive each other. But there is another layer to this story, a deeper level that transcends the personal grievances of two proud men. What happened between Eisenhower and Truman was not just a dispute about campaign rhetoric or hurt feelings. It was a clash between two fundamentally different conceptions of leadership, two different philosophies about how power should be exercised in a democracy, two different understandings of the relationship between military service and political authority. Truman represented the pure politician, the man who had clawed his way up through machine politics, who understood that governance was about compromise and coalition building, who believed that democratic leadership required getting your hands dirty, making deals, accepting that perfect was the enemy of good. He had not been born to power, he had seized it through persistence and luck. He had not been chosen for greatness, he'd been thrust upon him, and he had responded by making the hardest decisions imaginable, from dropping atomic bombs on Japan to firing Douglas MacArthur, always believing that the president must lead, must choose, must accept responsibility for consequences. Eisenhower represented something different, the warrior statesman, the man who had earned authority through competence and character, who believed that leadership was about integrity and long-term vision, rather than short-term political calculation. He had spent his entire adult life in an institution, the army, where hierarchy was clear, where orders were followed, where loyalty up and down the chain of command was the foundational value. He had commanded millions of men, coordinated operations of unimaginable complexity, and done it all while maintaining a public image of genial competence. To him, Truman's political horse trading looked like corruption, and Truman's willingness to attack him during the campaign looked like betrayal. These two visions of leadership, the political and the military, the pragmatic and the principled, the professional politician and the professional soldier, had coexisted uneasily throughout American history. The founders had been deeply suspicious of standing armies and military power, yet they had also recognized that military heroes like George Washington brought a unique form of legitimacy to civilian government. The tension was productive, a creative friction that helped maintain the balance between civilian control and military effectiveness. But in the aftermath of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War, that tension was becoming acute. The United States had emerged from the war as a global superpower with unprecedented military capabilities. It maintained a vast standing military for the first time in its peacetime history. It possessed atomic weapons that could incinerate entire cities. It had bases and alliances spanning the globe. The line between military and civilian authority, between wartime and peacetime, between foreign policy and domestic politics, was blurring. In this new world, what model of leadership was appropriate? The soldier who had won the war, or the politician who had authorized it? The fight between Eisenhower and Truman was, in many ways, America arguing with itself about what kind of country it wanted to be in this new age. And there was no clear answer, which is perhaps why both men felt so wounded, so justified in their anger. They were each defending a legitimate vision of American leadership, and each saw the other as threatening something essential. The symbolism of Eisenhower's refusal to enter the White House on Inauguration Day was profound, though perhaps not in the way most observers understood at the time. The White House is more than just a building, it is the physical embodiment of presidential authority, the place where Lincoln preserved the Union, where Theodore Roosevelt championed progressive reform, where Franklin Roosevelt guided the nation through depression and war. To refuse to enter it, even for a ceremonial cup of coffee, was to reject not just Truman personally, but something about what Truman represented. Eisenhower's biographers and defenders have often portrayed his refusal as simple pique, a moment of personal resentment that he later regretted. And there is truth to that interpretation. Eisenhower was human, capable of petty anger like anyone else. But there was also something more calculated, more deliberate. Eisenhower was establishing boundaries. He was signaling that he would not be Truman's successor in the narrow political sense, would not be the continuation of Truman's approach to governance. He was marking a clean break, a new beginning. The refusal to enter the White House was symbolic politics of the most potent kind. For Truman, standing in the Blue Room waiting for Eisenhower to arrive, the rejection must have been devastating. Truman, who had so carefully maintained the dignity of the office, even when his personal popularity plummeted, who had continued to show up, to do the work, to make the decisions, was now being snubbed by his successor on what should have been a day of mutual respect and national unity. The inauguration was supposed to demonstrate the strength of American democracy, the peaceful transfer of power that distinguished the United States from so many other nations where changes of government came through coups and revolutions. Instead, it demonstrated division, personal animosity, the breakdown of basic civility. When the two men finally rode together to the Capitol, the silence in the limousine was observed by Secret Service agents and reporters alike. No one recorded their exact expressions, but witnesses spoke of Truman staring straight ahead, his jaw tight, while Eisenhower looked out the window at the crowds. Neither man waved at first. Neither man acknowledged the other's presence. Only when the limousine reached areas where the crowds were thickest did they remember to play their roles, turning toward the people, raising their hands, smiling those practiced political smiles that concealed everything. The inauguration itself proceeded with all the usual pomp and ceremony. Chief Justice Fred Vinson administered the oath of office. Eisenhower delivered his inaugural address, speaking of peace, of the need to contain communist expansion through strength rather than appeasement, of the importance of fiscal responsibility and limited government. Truman sat behind him on the platform, his face an expressionless mask. When the ceremony concluded, Truman and his wife Bess left Washington immediately for their home in Independence, Missouri. They did not attend any of the inaugural balls or receptions. They boarded a train and departed, returning to the modest house on Delaware Street, where Truman had grown up, where he would live out his remaining years as a private citizen. In the years that followed, neither man softened significantly in his view of the other. Eisenhower would serve 2 terms as president, presiding over a period of relative peace and prosperity, managing the Cold War with a combination of nuclear deterrence and covert operations, building the interstate highway system, and appointing Earl Warren to the Supreme Court, a decision that would lead to the Brown v. Board of Education decision ending legal school segregation. He would be remembered as a moderate, pragmatic president, neither the conservative warrior that his Republican base had hoped for, nor the dangerous militarist that Democrats had feared. Truman would spend his retirement writing his memoirs, establishing his presidential library in Independence, and slowly rehabilitating his historical reputation. The man who had left office with approval ratings in the 20s would eventually be recognized as one of the most consequential presidents of the 20th century, praised for his decisive leadership during the early Cold War, for his willingness to make hard choices, for his plain-spoken integrity. But he never forgave Eisenhower. In his private papers, in his letters to friends, Truman continued to express contempt for the man who had succeeded him. Eisenhower, for his part, rarely spoke publicly about Truman after leaving office. He maintained the dignity that had characterized his military career, refusing to engage in public feuds with other former presidents. But privately, he made clear his view that Truman had been a small-minded political operator who had damaged the presidency and weakened American foreign policy. The respect that might have existed between them never materialized. They did meet again, once, in 1961, at the funeral of former Speaker of the House Sam Rayburn. Photographs from that day show them standing near each other, both elderly men now, both part of a passing generation. They shook hands, they exchanged brief, formal greetings, and then they separated, moving to different parts of the reception, circling back to their separate corners. The wounds had not healed, the anger had not dissipated. They were civil, but nothing more. There is a human tendency to want resolution in our stories, to want the feuding parties to reconcile, to learn from their mistakes, to find common ground in their shared humanity. We want Eisenhower and Truman to have a moment of understanding, to acknowledge their mutual contributions to American democracy, to shake hands with genuine warmth rather than cold formality. But history is not a Hollywood movie. Real people carry grudges to their graves. Real wounds do not always heal. What happened between Eisenhower and Truman matters not because it affected policy or changed the course of history in any direct way. Eisenhower would have pursued largely the same policies whether he had been on friendly terms with Truman or not. The government continued to function. The democratic process continued, but it matters because it reveals something true about the nature of leadership and the cost of power. Both men sacrificed enormously for their country. Eisenhower spent decades in military service, living on army bases, separated from his family, bearing the weight of decisions that sent thousands of young men to their deaths. Truman gave up his comfortable life in Missouri, accepted responsibility for ending World War II with nuclear weapons, made the terrible choice to enter the Korean War, and endured years of brutal political attacks. They both deserved gratitude, respect, and honor. But power isolates. The presidency, in particular, is a profoundly lonely office, a position where every decision has consequences beyond calculation, where friends become casualties of political necessity, where loyalty is always conditional and temporary. Eisenhower and Truman both learned this lesson, but they learned it in ways that made them unable to offer each other the understanding and compassion they both needed. The tragedy is that they had more in common than either man could acknowledge. Both were from modest backgrounds, from the American heartland, from families that valued hard work and plain dealing. Both had risen to extraordinary heights, not through inherited privilege, but through their own capabilities and determination. Both had faced decisions that would have broken lesser men, and had made those decisions without flinching. Both had devoted their lives to public service, to protecting and advancing American democracy during its most dangerous century. They should have been allies. They should have been friends. Instead, they became emblems of division, representatives of competing visions of American leadership that could not be reconciled. And that division, that inability to bridge the gap between military and political authority, between different conceptions of democratic governance, would echo through the decades that followed. Returning to that cold January morning in 1953, to Eisenhower sitting in the limousine refusing to enter the White House, we can now see the moment with clearer eyes. It was not just a personal dispute between two proud men. It was not just the result of campaign rhetoric and hurt feelings. It was the collision of two fundamentally different Americas, the America of military honor and hierarchical authority, and the America of political compromise and democratic misunderstanding. It was a preview of conflicts that would recur again and again in American history. As the nation struggled to define the proper relationship between its military institutions and its civilian government, between its idealistic self-image and its pragmatic political realities, Eisenhower's refusal was an act of defiance, a statement that some wounds cannot be papered over with false civility, that some betrayals cannot be forgiven for the sake of appearances. It was authentic in its anger, honest in its rejection, but it was also a failure to rise above personal grievance, a failure to model the kind of gracious leadership that democratic transitions require. A failure to recognize that the office is larger than the men who occupy it. Truman, waiting inside the White House, represented his own kind of failure, the failure to understand that political attacks, however justified they might seem, have personal consequences, that leaders have feelings and families, that the line between necessary criticism and personal cruelty is real even if it is difficult to locate precisely. His comment about Eisenhower's son, whether intended as a low blow or merely as a tone-deaf observation, revealed a certain blindness to how words can wound. Both men failed each other. Both men failed the ideal of democratic leadership that should have transcended their personal animosities. And yet, paradoxically, American democracy survived their failure. The government continued. The transition occurred. Eisenhower took the oath of office and became president. Truman boarded a train and became a private citizen. The system worked even when the men running it could not work together. Perhaps that is the deeper lesson of that cold morning in Washington. American democracy is not dependent on the personal virtue of its leaders, is not hostage to their ability to get along or their willingness to compromise their principles for the sake of civility. It is a system, a structure, a set of rules and norms and expectations that exists independent of the individuals who temporarily occupy positions of authority. Eisenhower and Truman could hate each other, could refuse to speak, could nurse their grievances until death, and the Republic would endure. But something is lost when leaders cannot rise above their personal conflicts. Something is lost when the transition of power becomes a cold ritual rather than a warm embrace. Something is lost when two men who have both served their country with distinction cannot find the grace to acknowledge each other's contributions. That loss is not constitutional or structural. The government functions regardless. It is a spiritual loss, a failure of human connection. a missed opportunity for reconciliation and understanding. The story of Eisenhower refusing to enter Truman's White House is often told as an amusing anecdote, a bit of historical trivia about two stubborn men and their petty feud. But it is more than that. It is a window into the psychology of power, the loneliness of leadership, the difficulty of maintaining human relationships in the pressure cooker of national politics. It is a reminder that even great men, even men who have displayed extraordinary courage and competence in the most difficult circumstances, are still human, still capable of pettiness and resentment, still wounded by criticism and betrayal. In the decades since that cold January morning, the relationship between Eisenhower and Truman has been reassessed many times. Historians have weighed their respective contributions, evaluated their policies, judged their decisions. Eisenhower is generally credited with skillful management of the Cold War, with avoiding major conflicts while maintaining American power, with presiding over a prosperous and relatively peaceful era. Truman is praised for his decisive leadership during the immediate post-war period, for establishing the framework of containment that would guide American foreign policy for decades, for his personal integrity and willingness to make unpopular decisions. Both men earned their places in the pantheon of consequential American presidents. Both men shaped the course of the 20th century in profound ways, and both men took their mutual resentment to their graves, never fully reconciling, never finding the peace that might have allowed them to appreciate each other's strengths and forgive each other's weaknesses. There is something profoundly sad about that, something that speaks to the cost of public service and the weight of historical responsibility. These were not petty men. These were not small-minded individuals obsessed with trivial slights. They were serious, capable, dedicated public servants who had devoted their lives to something larger than themselves. And yet, they could not overcome their personal conflicts, could not bridge the gap that had opened between them. Perhaps that is asking too much. Perhaps it is unrealistic to expect leaders to transcend their human limitations, to always place public duty above personal feeling, to maintain grace and dignity even when they feel betrayed and attacked. Perhaps the miracle is not that Eisenhower and Truman failed to reconcile, but that, despite their failure, the system continued to work, the country continued to function, and both men continued to serve in their respective roles with dedication and competence. The limousine carrying Eisenhower and Truman to the Capitol on January 20, 1953, moved slowly through the crowds, making its way down Pennsylvania Avenue toward the place where the oath would be administered and power would change hands. Inside that vehicle, two men sat in silence, separated by mere inches of physical distance but by a chasm of emotional and psychological estrangement that could not be measured. Behind them, the White House, the building Eisenhower had refused to enter, stood, as it had stood for a century and a half, as it would stand for centuries more, a symbol of continuity and stability in a world of constant change. The building endured. The office the system endured. The men passed through, served their time, and departed, leaving behind their achievements and their failures, their triumphs and their disappointments, their wisdom and their wounds. In the final accounting, what remains most striking about the Eisenhower-Truman feud is not the anger itself but the contrast between their public personas and their private resentments. To the American people in 1953, Eisenhower was the smiling general, the man whose grin had become as famous as his military victories, whose grandfatherly warmth made him seem approachable despite his 5-star rank. Truman was the plain-spoken Missourian, the man who kept a sign on his desk reading "The buck stops here," who spoke in simple declarative sentences about complex matters, who seemed to embody a kind of honest directness that Americans wanted to believe still existed in politics. Both images were real. Both men genuinely possessed the qualities that made them beloved by millions. But beneath those public faces lived the private men, proud, wounded, angry men who felt betrayed by someone they had trusted or respected, who carried grudges with the same intensity they had once carried their responsibilities of office. The contradiction is very human. We are all multiple selves, all performing different roles in different contexts, all capable of great generosity and petty vindictiveness, sometimes within the same hour. Leaders are not exempt from this fundamental human condition. They are simply required to maintain the performance more consistently, to keep the private self hidden more carefully, to present a unified face to the world, even when they are fragmenting internally. On Inauguration Day 1953, Both men maintained their performances. They sat in that limousine. They endured the silence. They waved to the crowds when required. They did not scream at each other or throw punches or storm off in different directions. They completed the ritual because the ritual was more important than their feelings. Because democracy requires these symbolic acts of continuity and legitimacy. Because both men, whatever their personal animosities, understood that they were playing roles in a drama much larger than themselves. But the cost of that performance was real. The emotional labor of sitting in silence next to someone you despise, of smiling for cameras when you want to scowl, of maintaining dignity when you feel humiliated, that labor extracts a price, and both men paid it, added it to the long list of sacrifices they had already made in service to their country. There is one more element to this story that deserves attention: the role of Eleanor Roosevelt, the widow of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. She had watched both men rise to prominence, had seen Truman struggle with the awesome responsibility of succeeding her husband, had observed Eisenhower's meteoric ascent from obscure colonel to supreme commander. She had strong opinions about both men, opinions that evolved over time. Initially, Eleanor Roosevelt had been skeptical of Truman. She had loved her husband deeply, despite the complications of their marriage, and she resented anyone who seemed to diminish Franklin's legacy. Truman, the accidental president, the man Franklin had barely known, seemed inadequate to fill those impossibly large shoes. But over time, she came to respect Truman's courage, his commitment to civil rights, his willingness to stand firm against McCarthyism, even when it was politically costly. She recognized in Truman something genuine, something decent, even if he lacked Franklin's patrician polish and political genius. Her view of Eisenhower was more complex. She had admired his wartime leadership, his ability to hold the Allied coalition together, his competence in executing the largest military operations in history. But during the 1952 campaign, when Eisenhower failed to defend George Marshall, when he stood silent while McCarthy spewed his poisonous accusations, Eleanor Roosevelt's admiration curdled into contempt. She wrote scathing columns about Eisenhower's moral cowardice. She actively campaigned for Adlai Stevenson, Truman's chosen successor in the Democratic nomination. She made clear her belief that Eisenhower had betrayed not just Marshall but the fundamental values that should guide American leadership. After the inauguration, Eleanor Roosevelt wrote in her diary about the coldness she had observed between Truman and Eisenhower, the visible tension, the absence of warmth or mutual respect. She understood, perhaps better than most, what it cost both men to maintain their composure during that transition. She had spent decades in the public eye, had learned to smile when her heart was breaking, had mastered the art of political performance. She recognized the same skill in Truman and Eisenhower, and she mourned what it revealed about the nature of power in America. Her observations matter because Eleanor Roosevelt represented a kind of moral clarity that was increasingly rare in the complicated world of Cold War politics. She believed in principles, in standing up for what was right, even when it was unpopular, in refusing to compromise core values for political advantage. She held leaders to high standards because she believed that high standards were necessary if democracy was to survive. And by those standards, both Eisenhower and Truman had failed. Eisenhower in his refusal to defend Marshall, Truman in his inability to rise above his anger and extend grace to his successor. Yet, Eleanor Roosevelt also understood something that perhaps the two men themselves could not fully grasp in the heat of their conflict. She understood that their feud, painful as it was to observe, was a kind of proof that American democracy was working. In a dictatorship, there would have been no peaceful transfer of power. The outgoing leader would have clung to office, or the incoming leader would have seized power by force. The personal animosity between leaders would have sparked violence, purges, coups. But in America, despite everything, the system held. Truman left office when his term expired. Eisenhower became president through a free and fair election. The government continued to function. The republic endured. This was not inevitable. Democracy is never inevitable. It requires constant maintenance, constant vigilance, constant commitment to norms and rules that exist independent of personal preference. The fact that Eisenhower and Truman, despite hating each other, still completed the ritual of transition was itself a victory for democratic principles. It was an imperfect victory, marred by coldness and resentment, but it was a victory nonetheless. As the years passed and both men aged, there were occasional moments when it seemed reconciliation might be possible. In 1961, when John F. Kennedy became president, he invited both Eisenhower and Truman to various state functions. At these events, the two former presidents were sometimes in the same room, navigating around each other like battleships in a narrow harbor, careful to maintain distance, cautious in their interactions. But there were no dramatic reconciliations, no tearful embraces, no public acknowledgments of past wrongs. Privately, some of Eisenhower's aides suggested he should reach out to Truman, if not for reconciliation, then at least to present a united front of former presidents supporting the current administration during the heightening tensions of the Cold War. Eisenhower rejected these suggestions. He had not forgiven Truman's attacks during the 1952 campaign. He had not forgotten what he perceived as Truman's pettiness and vindictiveness. The wound was still fresh even a decade later. Truman, for his part, showed no interest in reconciliation either. In his memoirs, published in the mid-, Truman offered tepid praise for Eisenhower's military achievements, but made clear his disappointment with Eisenhower's presidency, which he viewed as passive and insufficiently vigorous in confronting the challenges facing the nation. In interviews and private correspondence, Truman remained bitter, still angry about what he saw as Eisenhower's betrayal and moral cowardice. The stubbornness of both men in refusing to reconcile might seem admirable or frustrating, depending on one's perspective. On one hand, it represented a kind of integrity. Neither man was willing to engage in false gestures of friendship merely for public consumption. They were honest about their feelings, even when honesty was uncomfortable. On the other hand, it represented a failure of wisdom, an inability to see beyond personal grievances to larger truths about shared humanity and mutual sacrifice. Perhaps the most poignant moment came in 1964, when Truman suffered a fall in his home and was hospitalized. Eisenhower, then living in retirement on his farm in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, was asked by reporters whether he planned to visit Truman or send him a message. Eisenhower's response was carefully neutral. He expressed hope for Truman's recovery, but made no gesture of personal warmth. The message was clear. He would observe the basic courtesies required between former presidents, but nothing more. Truman recovered from that fall and lived another 8 years, dying finally in December 1972 at the age of 80. Eisenhower had preceded him in death by 3 years, passing away in March 1969 at age 7. Neither man attended the other's funeral, though of course Eisenhower could not have attended Truman's. But even when Eisenhower died, Truman's public statement was brief and formal, acknowledging Eisenhower's service, but offering no personal warmth, no reflection on their shared experiences, no attempt to find meaning in their intertwined lives. They died as they had lived during those final years, unreconciled, each convinced of his own righteousness and the other's failings. The opportunity for reconciliation passed, slipped away year by year, until finally there was no time left, no chance for the conversation that might have brought understanding, if not forgiveness. What does this story ultimately teach us? What wisdom can we extract from this tale of two proud men and their inability to overcome their mutual resentment? Perhaps the lesson is simply this: leadership is hard, power isolates, and grudges are easy to nurture and difficult to release. But there is something more, something deeper. The story of Eisenhower refusing to enter Truman's White House reminds us that democracy is not a machine that runs automatically, producing good governance through mechanical processes. It is a human system, dependent on human virtues like grace, humility, and the ability to see beyond personal grievances to larger purposes. When those virtues are absent, democracy becomes colder, more brittle, more susceptible to breakdown. Yet democracy also has a resilience that transcends individual failures. The system that the founders created, with its checks and balances, its separation of powers, its commitment to regular elections and peaceful transitions, can survive even when leaders behave badly. It can survive personal feuds, political attacks, and the breakdown of civility. It survived the Eisenhower-Truman conflict, and it has survived many others since. The danger comes not from individual failures, but from accumulated failures, from the gradual erosion of norms and expectations, from the slow acceptance of behavior that would once have been considered unacceptable. Each time leaders fail to rise above their personal conflicts, each time public service becomes indistinguishable from personal ambition, each time civility is sacrificed for political advantage, the foundation of democratic governance weakens just a bit. Eisenhower and Truman were both, in their own ways, committed to preserving and strengthening American democracy. They both believed in the Constitution, in civilian control of the military, in the rule of law, in the importance of free elections and peaceful transitions of power. But their personal conflict demonstrated how even the most committed Democrats can undermine the very system they seek to protect when they allow personal grievances to override institutional responsibilities. The image of that limousine moving slowly down Pennsylvania Avenue, carrying two silent men who would not look at each other, remains powerful more than 70 years later. It is an image of failure, not policy failure or military failure, but human failure, the failure to transcend ego and anger and hurt pride. It is an image that should make us uncomfortable because it reveals something true about the limits of leadership and the fragility of the norms that hold democratic societies together. In the end, the White House that Eisenhower refused to enter on that cold January morning stood as it had always stood, enduring, indifferent to the dramas of the men who temporarily occupied it. The building had seen other conflicts, other feuds, other moments of tension between leaders. It had witnessed the bitter rivalry between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, the contempt that Andrew Jackson felt for John Quincy Adams, the animosity between Herbert Hoover and Franklin Roosevelt. The Eisenhower-Truman conflict was part of a long tradition of presidential feuds, each shaped by its own particular circumstances, but all sharing certain common elements: pride, ambition, competing visions of leadership, and the painful recognition that power is temporary. While resentments can last a lifetime, the building endured because it represented something larger than any individual president. It represented the office itself, the idea of democratic leadership, the continuity of government across generations and across party lines. Eisenhower's refusal to enter might have been a rejection of Truman personally, but it could not be a rejection of the presidency itself. Hours after refusing to step inside for coffee, Eisenhower would take the oath of office and become the building's next occupant, inheriting all the responsibilities and burdens that came with it. There is something almost Greek in the tragic inevitability of that progression. Eisenhower refusing the gesture of reconciliation with Truman, then immediately assuming the same office, the same pressures, the same impossible expectations that had shaped Truman's presidency and would now shape his own. In rejecting Truman, Eisenhower was in some sense rejecting his own future, denying the continuity that would soon become inescapable, and indeed, Eisenhower's presidency would in many ways vindicate Truman's approach more than Eisenhower might have cared to admit. Like Truman, Eisenhower would find that the presidency offered few easy choices, that foreign policy required constant compromise and calculation, that domestic politics demanded patience and pragmatism. Like Truman, Eisenhower would be criticized by members of his own party for being insufficiently ideological, for pursuing policies of moderation rather than confrontation. Like Truman, Eisenhower would leave office with many of his goals unfulfilled, many of his hopes disappointed, knowing that history would have to judge whether his choices had been wise. The parallels between their presidencies make their personal estrangement all the more poignant. They faced similar challenges, made similar choices, and achieved similar mixed results. They both demonstrated courage and leadership during critical moments. They both made mistakes that would be debated by historians for generations. They were, in many fundamental ways, brothers in the difficult fraternity of the presidency. But they could not acknowledge that brotherhood, could not offer each other the understanding and support that might have eased the burden they both carried. As we reflect on that cold morning in January 1953, standing at a distance of more than 7 decades, we can see things that the participants themselves could not see. We can see how their conflict was shaped by forces larger than either man. The transformation of America from an isolationist republic to a global superpower, the militarization of American society in response to the Cold War, the changing nature of political campaigns and media coverage, the stress placed on democratic institutions by the existential threat of nuclear annihilation. We can see how both men were products of their time and place, shaped by experiences that made certain attitudes and behaviors inevitable. Eisenhower, forged in the hierarchical world of the military, where clear chains of command and institutional loyalty were paramount, naturally recoiled from what he perceived as Truman's political opportunism and personal attacks. Truman, who had fought his way up through the rough-and-tumble world of machine politics, where loyalty was tested constantly and betrayal was punished swiftly, naturally interpreted Eisenhower's campaign tactics and his silence about Marshall as fundamental character failures. Neither man was wrong. Exactly. Each was judging the other by standards that made sense within his own framework of experience. But neither man could step outside that framework long enough to understand the other's perspective, to grant the possibility that different backgrounds might produce different but equally valid approaches to leadership. This is, perhaps, the deepest tragedy of their conflict. It was not inevitable. With more empathy, more generosity, more willingness to see the complexity in the other person, reconciliation might have been possible. But both men had spent decades in positions where empathy was dangerous, where showing vulnerability could be exploited, where hardness and resolve were rewarded and softness was punished. They had become very good at being hard and very bad at being soft. The presidency amplified these tendencies. The office demands so much, extracts such a heavy toll, that presidents often become brittle under the pressure. They develop thick skins because they must, because the alternative is to be destroyed by the constant criticism and second-guessing that comes with the job. But those thick skins make genuine human connection difficult. They create barriers that are hard to lower, even when lowering them might be beneficial. Eisenhower and Truman both developed those thick skins, both built those barriers, and in the end, those defenses prevented them from reaching out to each other. They remained locked in their mutual resentment, prisoners of their own pride, unable or unwilling to take the first step toward reconciliation. In the decades since that frozen transition, scholars have examined every aspect of the Eisenhower-Truman relationship, analyzing their correspondence, interviewing their associates, searching for the precise moment when friendship might have been salvaged or the point of no return was crossed. The consensus that has emerged is that both men bear responsibility for the breakdown, that neither was entirely wrong or entirely right, that the conflict was overdetermined by multiple causes ranging from the personal to the political to the structural. But perhaps the most important insight from all this scholarship is simply this: even great leaders are human, subject to the same emotions and weaknesses as everyone else. The qualities that make someone an effective president or general confidence, decisiveness, the ability to project authority can also make that person stubborn, unforgiving, and unable to admit error. The same strength of character that allows a leader to make difficult decisions can also prevent that leader from making the humble gestures that human relationships require. This is not an excuse for Eisenhower and Truman. Both men should have done better. Both men should have found the grace to rise above their personal conflicts for the sake of the country they both loved. But it is an explanation, and perhaps a warning. We should not expect our leaders to be superhuman. We should not demand that they transcend all ordinary human limitations. But we should also not excuse them when they fail to meet basic standards of decency and civility, when they allow personal grudges to interfere with their public responsibilities. The challenge is to maintain realistic expectations while still holding leaders accountable, to understand human frailty while still demanding ethical behavior, to grant empathy while still insisting on standards. It is a difficult balance, one that every generation of citizens must negotiate anew as they evaluate their leaders and decide what kinds of behavior to accept or reject. The morning of January 20th, 1953, eventually gave way to afternoon, and the inauguration ceremonies concluded. Eisenhower delivered his speech, took the oath, and became president. Truman boarded his train for independence. The crowds dispersed. The flags were taken down. Washington returned to its normal rhythms of work and politics and intrigue. Life went on, as it always does, indifferent to the personal dramas of even the most powerful individuals. In the years that followed, both men would reflect privately on that day, though neither left detailed accounts of their feelings. Eisenhower's diary entries from the period are sparse and formal, focused on policy matters rather than personal emotions. Truman's memoir treats the inauguration briefly, acknowledging the coldness but not dwelling on it. Both men, it seems, preferred to move forward rather than rehash old grievances, at least in their public writings. But those who knew them well reported that neither man forgot, neither truly forgave. The wound remained tender to the touch, a permanent scar on both their lives. And perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps some wounds should not heal completely, should not be forgiven too easily. Perhaps the memory of betrayal, whether real or perceived, serves a purpose in reminding us of our obligations to each other, our responsibilities to the institutions we serve, our duty to rise above petty concerns for the sake of larger purposes, or perhaps that is giving too much credit to stubbornness and pride. Perhaps the failure of reconciliation was simply that of failure, pure and simple, a missed opportunity for two men to demonstrate the grace and wisdom that their positions demanded. Perhaps future historians will judge them harshly for their inability to overcome their personal conflicts. Will see their feud as a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting ego interfere with duty. Time will tell. History's judgment continues to evolve as new evidence emerges and new perspectives develop. What seems clear now may seem muddled in another generation. What appears to be a tragic failure of leadership may come to be understood as an inevitable result of impossible circumstances. The story is not finished because history is never finished, never final, always subject to reinterpretation and revision. But the image remains. Eisenhower sitting in the limousine, refusing to enter the White House, Truman emerging alone, two men riding in silence to the Capitol where power would change hands despite their mutual animosity. It is an image that captures something essential about American democracy: its resilience in the face of human weakness, its ability to function even when leaders fail to meet our highest expectations, its stubborn persistence despite the conflicts and contradictions that constantly threaten to tear it apart. That persistence, that resilience, that stubborn refusal to collapse even when it should, perhaps that is the real lesson of January 20th, 1953. Not that leaders should behave better, though they should. Not that personal conflicts should be overcome, though they should be. But that democracy, for all its flaws and limitations, possesses a strength that transcends individual failures. The system holds, the government continues, the peaceful transfer of power occurs, and the republic endures, imperfect and wounded but still standing, still functioning, still offering hope that tomorrow might be better than today.